The gas lamps of lower Manhattan flickered against the damp cobblestones, casting long, trembling shadows that stretched out like fingers trying to hold on to the day. It was the autumn of 1912, a time when the city was growing faster than the people could walk, a chaotic symphony of horse-drawn carriages, the rumble of the elevated trains, and the shouts of peddlers selling chestnuts and newspapers. In the midst of this relentless noise, on a narrow street lined with towering tenement buildings, there existed a quiet world, shared only by two people. Elias was a man of routine, a quiet soul who worked as a clerk in the shipping district. He lived on the third floor of a red brick walk-up, his days measured by the ticking of a pocket watch and the stacking of ledgers. He was not a man given to grand gestures or loud conversations. He preferred the solitude of a park bench to the crowded saloons, finding peace in the orderly rhythm of his own thoughts. His life was a straight line, unbroken and unremarkable. Until the evening, a young woman moved into the apartment across the hall. Her name was Clara. She worked long hours in a garment factory a dozen blocks away, her fingers often stained with the dye of fabrics and pricked by the needles of the industrial machines that roared like angry beasts. She was small in stature, but she carried herself with a dignity that made her seem taller, her head always held high despite the exhaustion that etched faint lines around her eyes. Their first encounter was not a meeting of words, but of moments. It happened on the shared landing of the third floor, a cramped space with a single window that looked out onto the brick wall of the next building. The air in the hallway always smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool, a mixture of the lives lived behind the closed doors. Elias was fumbling for his key, his hands cold from the biting wind off the river. The door across the hall opened, and Clara stepped out, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She stopped, waiting for him to unlock his door so she could pass without brushing against him. Elias looked up, his breath hitching slightly in the cold air. He nodded, a small, stiff movement of his head. Clara nodded back. There was no smile, just a recognition of existence, a silent agreement that they were neighbors in this crowded city. She waited patiently as he turned the key, the metal scraping loudly in the silence. As the door swung open, he stepped aside, pressing his back against the frame to allow her space. She murmured a soft, almost inaudible thank you, and descended the stairs, the soft sound of her shoes fading into the building's echo. From that night on, their lives became interwoven not through conversation, but through the delicate architecture of daily routine. They were two ships passing in the fog, aware of each other's presence but never dropping anchor. Every morning at 6 o'clock, Elias would leave for work. Precisely 10 minutes later, Clara would emerge. They began to time their departures with a subtle precision. Elias would slow his pace on the staircase, his hand lingering on the worn mahogany railing, hoping to catch a glimpse of her leaving her door. If he saw her, he would tip his hat. If she saw him, she would offer a glance that lasted a fraction of a second longer than a polite stranger would. Winter turned to spring, and the city shed its grey coat for the dust of construction and the smell of asphalt. The windows of the tenement were thrown open to catch the faint breeze. Elias found himself listening for the sounds of her life, the creak of her floorboards as she moved around her room in the evening, the sound of her door opening as she left for the market. He learned the rhythm of her footsteps, lighter and quicker than his own heavy tread. They shared the stoop in the evenings, sitting on the top step, separated by a few feet of wooden slats. The city buzzed around them, children playing stickball in the gutter, the screech of streetcar brakes, the murmur of gossip from the windows below. They rarely spoke. There was an unspoken rule between them, a protective barrier formed by the social constraints of the time and their own reserved natures. To speak might break the fragile spell of their connection. To speak might reveal too much, or worse, reveal nothing at all. One hot summer night, a blackout swept through the neighborhood, plunging the tenements into darkness. The city, usually ablaze with light, became a void. Elias sat on the stoop, smoking a cigarette, the glowing ember the only light on the block. Clara came down, a candle in a jar in her hand, looking for air. She stopped when she saw the red dot of his cigarette. "I didn't know anyone was out here," she said. Her voice was tired but soft, carrying a hint of a melody he had never heard before. "Just watching the stars," Elias replied, though the smoke and city lights usually hid the sky. "It's cooler here." She sat down on the opposite end of the stoop, setting the candle down between them. The small flame danced in the warm air, casting a soft glow on her face. For the first time, Elias saw her clearly without the rush of morning or the shadow of the hallway. She looked weary, her hands rough from work, but her eyes were bright, holding a depth of sadness and hope that fascinated him. "The factory is unbearable in this heat," she said, almost to herself. "The foreman won't open the windows. Says it makes the fabric fade." Elias nodded, flicking an ash onto the pavement. "Men like that value cloth more than breath." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment, the darkness between them shrank. "You work at the docks, don't you?" "The shipping office," he corrected. "Paperwork mostly, but the noise is the same." They sat there for an hour, talking about small things, the price of bread, the heat wave, the rude behavior of the grocer on the corner. They did not talk about themselves, their families, or their pasts. They did not speak of the future. It was a conversation constructed of safety, built on the foundation of their shared silence. When the streetlights flickered back on, buzzing with electric life, the spell broke. Clara stood up, picking up her candle. "Good night, Elias," she said. "Good night, Clara." He watched her go up the stairs, the light from the hallway illuminating her back for a second before she disappeared behind her door. He did not sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of a voice saying his name. He realized then that he had constructed a life around the possibility of these small encounters. His love for her was not a fire, but a slow, steady erosion of his own solitude. He loved the way she held her head, the way she smoothed her skirt before sitting, the way she seemed to carry the weight of the city without crumbling. But he also knew that in their world, love was a practical thing, often arranged by families or necessitated by survival. There was no room for the quiet adoration of a clerk and a seamstress. Years passed, the horse-drawn carriages disappeared, replaced by automobiles that honked and sputtered. The Great Depression gripped the city, turning the vibrant streets into lines of weary men waiting for bread. The tenement changed. Families moved out, replaced by others who could barely scrape together the rent. Elias and Clara remained, their routines becoming a lifeline in the chaos. The turning point came not with a shout, but with a whisper of opportunity. It was 1939. The war in Europe was casting a long shadow over American shores, but here in the city, the concern was still mostly about work and survival. Clara's small factory had closed, leaving her with few options. A cousin in Chicago had written to her, promising work in a newer, larger factory and a room in a boarding house run by distant relatives. Elias learned of this, not from her, but from the landlady, Mrs. Gable, who complained about the trouble of finding new tenants. "She's leaving next Tuesday," Mrs. Gable said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Going to the Windy City. Can't say I blame her. Things are tough here." Elias felt the news like a physical blow. He stood in the doorway of his apartment, his key in his hand, but he could not turn it. He looked across the hall at her door. It was closed, the paint peeling in small flakes. He wanted to knock. He wanted to tell her that he could help, that he had savings, that he had been promoted to a junior manager. He wanted to tell her that he would walk her to the factory every day if she stayed. But the words stuck in his throat, choked by the fear of rejection and the realization of his own inadequacy. He had never courted her. He had never bought her flowers. He had only nodded and shared a stoop. Who was he to ask her to stay? The days until her departure blurred together. Elias watched from his window as she packed her life into 2 large trunks. He saw the expressman come to haul them away. He waited for her to knock on his door, to say goodbye, but she did not. Perhaps she thought he didn't care. Perhaps she thought his silence was indifference. Or perhaps, like him, she found the act of goodbye too painful to speak aloud. On the morning of her departure, a heavy rain fell over the city, turning the streets into grey rivers. Elias stood by the window, his hand pressed against the cold glass. Down on the street, a yellow taxi waited, its engine idling. The door of the building opened. Clara emerged, wearing a beige trench coat and a small hat pinned to her hair. She carried only a handbag. She paused at the top of the stoop, looking up at the building. Her gaze swept across the windows, lingering for a second on the 3rd floor. Elias stepped back into the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could not let her see him watching. He could not burden her with the weight of his unspoken goodbye. She descended the stairs slowly, clutching the railing. She got into the taxi. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the stream of traffic, and was gone. Elias remained in his apartment for a long time. The room felt hollow, the silence louder than it had ever been. He continued his routines. He went to work. He ate his dinner in the small diners. He sat on the stoop in the evenings, but the space next to him remained empty. The city continued to grow, buildings rising higher and higher, blocking out what little sky remained. Decades passed. the neighborhood transformed, the old tenements giving way to high-rise luxury apartments. The price of a loaf of bread went from pennies to dollars, and the world spun on its axis, indifferent to the small lives lived within it. Elias grew old. He retired and eventually moved to a smaller apartment in a quieter part of the city, far from the hustle of the docks and the garment district. One afternoon in the early 1960s, Elias, now a man with white hair and slow steps, found himself back in the old neighborhood. He wanted to see the building one last time before it was torn down. He stood across the street, leaning on a cane. The old red brick was covered in scaffolding, the windows boarded up. The stoop where they had sat was crumbling. He closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him. He did not see the ruin before him. He saw the gaslights, the bustling crowds, and the young woman in the shawl. He realized then that their love had not been a failure. It had been a success in its own quiet way. It had sustained him through the long years of solitude. It had given him a standard by which he measured all other things. The love they shared and spoken, unacted upon, and pure had remained untouched by the disappointments and compromises of real life. It existed in the amber of his memory, perfect and frozen. A young couple walked past him, holding hands, laughing about something trivial. Elias watched them go. He thought of Clara, wherever she was, in Chicago, or perhaps gone to a place beyond the cities. He hoped she had found happiness. He hoped she had found someone who could give her the words he never could. Elias turned his collar up against the wind and walked away. He did not look back. The building would soon be gone, reduced to dust and rubble. But what had happened there would not. A love that is never spoken out loud is the hardest to forget, because it was never tested by reality. It was a love that crossed centuries and refused to be forgotten, living on quietly in the heartbeat of a city that never sleeps, and in the memory of a man who once shared a stoop with a ghost.